All right, I am on with Advanced Algebra 1, 5th period. Let's make sure that this is clear because I've been having Wi-Fi problems all day. There's Brittany. Hey, Brittany. If we can give awards, Brittany, for the best coronavirus students, I think that would be you, because you're on during every live session, and I appreciate it. Maybe we can give that best coronavirus student. Oh my gosh, it's Aaliyah. Hey, Aaliyah. Long time no see. All right, I think it's pretty clear. I'm glad y'all are watching because this lesson, it's going to start out pretty easy and then it gets a little confusing, and I'll go slow and try to explain it well. Just stay with me. We're getting into some harder lessons now with quadratic equations because we're, of course, at the end of Algebra 1. We actually only have, like, when we do another two more lessons with this unit on quadratics, we will, like if we were working out of the textbook, we would pretty much be through with the book except for the very last chapters on probability, and I hope to be able to cover some of that before we get out of school. All right, we are... Oh, yay! See, that's a good friend, Brittany, to make Aaliyah do her work. Aaliyah, see, she's taking care of you. Okay. We're going to solve quadratic equations by completing the square. You know, we have solved quadratic equations by the square root, using square roots. We've solved quadratic equations by factoring. And now we're going to take a quadratic equation and solve it by completing the square. And before we actually do the solving part, we're going to go through some examples of just completing the square. That's the really, really easy part. And I'm also going to give you an IXL on just that part. But then I'm going to continue with the lesson for another IXL. So you're going to have 2 IXLs to do between now and next Tuesday. First thing we want to do is remember what a perfect square trinomial is. Because we're going to be working with trinomials, quadratics, and these are perfect squares, and that's why it's called completing the square. Remember, whenever we were factoring these kind of problems right here, and if this was a perfect square at the beginning and this was a perfect square at the end, we factored it into one binomial to the second power. Do y'all remember how to do that? We took the square root of x to the second, which is just x, and brought the minus down, and took the square root of the last term 9, which is 3, and that's how you factored it. Or you could have factored it as x minus 3 times x minus 3. And I believe when we were doing that, I told y'all, because someone asked if they could just put x minus 3 times x minus 3. And I believe I told you that later on you were going to need to have it in this form, in a binomial to the second power. And so that's what we're doing today. You're going to need to be able to put it in this form. Before we get to that, though, what we're going to do is take a problem that's just partway done, and you've got to complete it. So you're going to be given like the x squared minus 6x, and you've got to come up with the 9. So I'm going to show you how to do that in this one right here. This says, what if you had to complete the trinomial so it was a perfect square trinomial? So what if you had this, the x squared plus 10x, and you didn't have that last number right there? Do y'all want to take a guess at what you think would go right here to make this a perfect square trinomial? If you think you know, just type that number in. If you don't know, that's fine. I'm gonna show you. I thought I'd give you a minute to see if you know, though. My live button is flashing in and out. That means it's not connected very well. I hope y'all can see this. You may not even be connected anymore. So I'm going to go ahead and answer. What would go here, the way that we're going to do this is whatever's in the middle. Remember, that's the B term. You've got the A, B, and the C term, and we're trying to find C. So you take the B term, which is 10, and you divide it by 2. That's what I've got right here. So we're going to half that. And once you half it, you square it. So this is the formula. You take B, and you divide it by 2, and whatever that answer is, you square that, and it's what goes in this blank. So half of 10 is 5, and when you square 5, you get 25. Does that make sense? So, for the first few examples, that's all we're going to be doing. We're going to learn how to complete the trinomial so that it's a perfect square trinomial. So, look at example 1. Example 1, complete the square. So we have x squared plus 8x, and then we've got to put in what c is going to be right here. So you take half of 8, and I'm just going to write it underneath. What's half of 8? Half of 8 is 4, and then we're going to square 4. And 4 squared is 16, and that's all you do. You put in 16. So then you look and you have this perfect square trinomial, x squared plus 8x plus 16. All right. Example 2. Complete the square. What do y'all think this would be right here? And you know, one thing you don't have to worry about is the sign. It's always going to be plus at the end, because when you square anything, even if you square a negative, it's positive. So because you have to half it and square it, it's always going to be a positive at the end. So you just put the number in. Y'all want to tell me what you think goes right here in this blank? X squared minus 12x plus... Oh, you need to slow down. I'll slow down. Sorry. So to get that last term that goes in the blank, you take your middle term. In fact, it's not really your middle term, but it's going to be your middle term. Like, you're going to be given just this, x squared minus 12x. And then you've got to complete the square. And the number that you put here is going to complete the square. And you get that by taking this term that's in front of x, negative 12, or that number that's in front of x, and you half it. And then once you half it, you square it. So that's going to, in the parentheses right here, half of 12 is 6. And remember, it doesn't matter about the sign. So 6 squared is 6 times 6, which is 36. You good with that? So on this next one, we have r squared plus 20r. And I'm going to pause for a minute. Make sure that you've been able to write it down. And then you tell me if you know what will go here at the end to make that a perfect square trinomial. You still with me? If you have r squared plus 20r, to get this third term at the end, you've got to take 20 and divide it by 2. You got to half it. So what do you get when you half 20? When you half 20, that's 10, right? And then you square 10. And 10 squared is 100. So 100 would be your answer. Okay, so let's just, before we go into this next example, I want to make sure y'all got this. So, let's say your problem is x squared plus 14x. And you've got to have another term down here because you want it to be a trinomial. And so, the term that goes down here to make it a perfect square, remember it's always plus at the end. You take the 14, the number that's in front of the x to the first power. So you take the 14 and you half it. What's half of 14? 7. And then you square 7. You always square that number, and so that's going to be 49. That would be your answer to complete the square. You understand that? Let's do another. I'm going to see if you can answer this one, if you're still there. I can't tell. N squared minus let's go with 18. Minus 18. Oh, wrong letter. Christy, wrong letter. Let me do another one right here. N squared minus 18n. And then y'all have got to tell me what number am I going to put at the end to make that a perfect square trinomial. Y'all still with me? To complete the square, n squared minus 18n, you take this 18 that's next to the n, and you half it. When you half 18, then you have to square it. Half of 18 is 9, and 9 squared is 81. Do you need more work with this, or do you understand this? Let me give you another one, and then y'all tell me the answer to this one. X squared. Let's do 16x. Okay, x squared plus 16x. Now, what number am I going to put here at the end to make that a perfect square trinomial? Type in the answer, please. I want to see that you understand it. This is a 16. It looks like it's kind of breaking up again. Half 16, half of 16 is 8, and 8 squared is 64. Okay. So you understand those. I hope you understand. You say you understand, but you didn't answer the problem. But let's move on now. We have 2 more examples to do like this, completing the square. But these are going to be odd numbers in the middle of our trinomial. So look at example 4. Complete the square. N squared plus 11n, and then we've got to put a number here at the end. Well, when you have an odd number in the middle, okay, yeah, it is really delayed. My live button keeps going in and out like it's not connected really well. On this example 4, n squared plus 11n, when you half 11, you get a decimal or a fraction, and they want these to be in fraction form. You're going to need it to stay in fraction form. So that means you just take your 11 and put it over 2. You take half of 11 that way. And you don't actually divide it. You just leave it 11 over 2. And then you square that. And when you square a fraction, remember, you just square the top and the bottom. So 11 squared is 11 times 11. And that's going to go on top, which is 121. And then you'll put in your fraction bar, which on IXL, if they don't have a fraction for you, it's the slash key. And then on bottom, you square the 2. 2 times 2. And you get 121 over 4. So that will be the fraction that completes your square. And then on this last one, example 5, we have a 5 next to y in the middle. So again, that's an odd number. When you half it, you just get 5 over 2. So you leave 5 over 2, and then you square that. And when you square 5 over 2, you get 5 times 5 on top, which is 25, over 2 times 2 on bottom, which is 4. All right, now the lesson on IXL that goes with this is BB9. So you need to get a SMART score. The reason I want you to go to 85 instead of 80, I think it's going to take you getting to 85 to get one of these with the odd numbers, and I wanted y'all to do one of those. So BB9, SMART score of 85. And now we're going to continue. This is the first step to do in the rest of the lesson that we're going to do. That's why we had to do this first. It's really important that you get this. That's why there's a whole IXL lesson on it. And now we're going to continue with example 6, and we're going to start doing the solving process. Now the solving process, we're going to need a calculator. And it looks like my daughter stole my calculator again. So I'm going to have to go look for that. Alright, so go ahead and write down this example 6 while I'm looking for the calculator. Solve the equation by completing the square, because it's going to help you to write this down instead of just watching me. I better go find the calculator. Oh, it's not far. It's right here. We're going to get decimal answers on a lot of these. Most of these will get decimal answers. And you have to be really careful about rounding, because when I was going through the IXL, I missed some of these. not because I rounded wrong, but because I accidentally like looked at it wrong or hit the wrong number. So it's got to be rounded to the nearest hundredth. You got to make sure you know how to round your decimals. Excuse me, I'm getting the hiccups. Okay. So now notice the directions on this. Instead of completing the square, this says solve solve the equation by completing the square. So we got to start off doing what we were doing with completing the square. When you start an equation off, I'm going to zoom in a little bit since we have a little extra room. Whenever you're solving by completing the square, you want to have, when you have an equation, a quadratic equation, we've talked about this before, you have the standard form, which is, the standard form is ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. Well, whenever you're solving by completing the square, if this c term right here is not a perfect square, it doesn't need to be there. It needs to be on the other side. So you're going to need your c to be over here on this side. And so that's the first thing that you look at, is you look to see if you have a perfect square trinomial over here already. And if you don't, then you are ready to complete the square. So you've got your 31 over on the right side. That's where it's supposed to be. You don't want 0 on these. You want it to, when we were solving by factoring, you wanted a 0 on that side. But now you want your c to be over here on the right side of your equal sign. So we've just got to take p squared plus 4p, and we've got to complete that square. We've got to do what we just got finished doing. So I'm going to come underneath it and rewrite it as p squared plus 4p, and now we want to complete the square right here. So remember, to complete the square, you take half of 4, and I'm going to come over here just so you'll know how I did it. I'm going to take half of 4, and then you've got to square that. Half of 4 is 2, and 2 squared is 4. So to complete the square, you get a 4. Well, y'all know what happens in equations. You've got to keep them balanced. So if you take an equation and you add something to one side, you've got to add that same exact thing to the other side. So we've got to add the plus 4 over here on the right side. And then once we do that, we've got to simplify this 31 plus 4. So we've got p squared plus 4p plus 4 equals 31 plus 4 is 35. All right, now we've got to solve for p. And to solve for p, we want to take this trinomial that's now a perfect square trinomial, and we want to factor it into our parentheses to the second power. And remember, all you've got to do is take the square root of the first term and the last term. So you're going to get p plus, use plus because that's the sign in the middle. Take the square root of 4, which is 2. So you get p plus 2 to the second power, and bring your 35 down. Well, now we've got to solve, and we learned when you're solving an equation for a variable that's to the second power, you've got to take the square root of both sides. That's why we learned how to solve by taking the square roots. So we've got to take the square root of this left side to cancel out that little 2. That means we've got to take the square root of the right side, because you always do the same thing to both sides of your equation. And then the square root with this square, they cancel each other out, and you're just left what's in the parentheses. Drop your parentheses though. So you're left with p plus 2 equals, and remember when you're solving with a square root, you've got to do plus or minus, and then that square root of 35. Well, now we're solving for p still, so we've got to get rid of this 2 by subtracting 2. So we're going to put that minus 2. I like to put it, instead of putting minus 2 at the very end of the problem, I like to put the -2 in front of the plus or minus because that's the way that I've always written it, that most math teachers always write it. I know Miss Gibson will write it that way. So right here, we've got to subtract this 2, and when we subtract it, we're just left with P equals. And we've got to subtract 2 on the right side, but I'm going to put my -2 in front of the plus or minus. And then we put the square root of 35. Now, if it were up to me, that would be your answer. But IXL wants you to put in your 2 separate answers. So we've got to do P equals -2 plus the square root of 35 and get a decimal answer. And I'm going to put equals beside it because I'm going to put my decimal answer right here. Then we're going to get another answer by doing that same thing, but use the minus sign in front of the square root of 35. So we're going to do -2 minus the square root of 35. And then we're going to get that decimal answer. Okay, so let me get my calculator. So I'm going to punch in -2 plus the square root of 35. Hit equals, and then you've got to use the SD key to change it to decimal. And you've got to round that to the nearest hundredth. Remember, the hundredth spot is where the 1 is. So it's going to be 3.9, and then you've got to round the 1 up to 2 because of the 6 that's behind that 1. Anything in that third position behind the decimal, anything 5 or higher is going to make that number in front of it round up. So that's going to be 3.91. No, I'm sorry, 3.92. 3.92 is one of your answers. And then to get the other answer, we've got to do -2 minus the square root of 35. So I'm going to clear that and do -2 minus the square root of 35. And then do the SD key, and that's going to be -7.92. -7.92. And I know, trust me, I know, completing the square is difficult for some people. So it'll take you a little bit of practice with these. Kind of blocking off that example 7. Now I'm going to sit here for a minute. Let y'all go back over that, see if you have a question, and then we'll go on to this next problem. On all of these, you're going to get 2 answers because you've got to do it one time with a plus sign in front of your square root and one time with a minus sign in front of your square root. And just make sure that you round these right. You don't want to miss these problems because you missed the rounding. Hey Hunter, we are doing Advanced Algebra 1. I did your class earlier, like at 12:30. I was having Wi-Fi problems. So your video should still be on here. I haven't uploaded it to YouTube yet. Brittany, are y'all still here? All right, moving on to example 7. On example 7, we have h² minus 18h equals 19. So remember, this is how you want it to start. You want your number, you want your C term to be over here on the right side so you can complete your square on the left side. So we have h squared minus 18h equals 19. So we've got to do our first part, which is completing the square on the left side. Remember, to complete that square, you take your middle number. It doesn't matter if it's positive or negative. You can just forget about that. And then you half it. And once you half that, you square that answer. So half of 18 is 9. So you're going to do 9 squared. So that's what you're going to add on both sides, whatever 9 squared is. So let's rewrite h to the second minus 18h. It's always plus, and then what you get when you square the 9, which is 81. Bring down your 19, and then you've got to also add 81 to the right side. Now make sure when you complete your square on the left side, that number that you put in at the end, you also add that number on the other side of your equal sign. And then the next step, we take the perfect square trinomial on the left side, h squared minus 18h plus 81, and we factor it. And when you factor it, you put it into the binomial square. Remember, you take the square root of the first term in the trinomial, which is going to be h because you half your exponents. Put the sign that's in the middle and take the square root of the 81, which is going to be 9. And then on the right side, you add your 19 plus 81, which is going to be, what is that, 100? 1 plus 9 and 8 plus 1 plus 1, yeah, that's 100. Now this is going to work out nice because you won't have to have your calculator since you've got a perfect square over here on this right side. Remember, once we've factored it and we've simplified the right side, you are ready to solve your equation for h. And when you solve it and you've got this square, remember, to solve a variable that is being squared, you've got to take the square root because you've got to do the opposite operation. And you have to take the square root of both sides. And when you take the square root of this left side, you just cancel out the exponent 2 and write down what's in your parentheses, h minus 9. On the right side, remember, when you're solving an equation with a square root, always use plus or minus. You get 2 answers. The square root of 100 is a positive or a negative 10. So you put plus or minus 10. And now you've got to get rid of this minus 9. The whole point is to solve for h. We want to get h by itself. So we've got to move minus 9 to the other side through addition because you did the opposite operation. That means when it comes to this right side, it's positive. And I told y'all on these, you need to always put that number in front of your plus or minus. So my positive 9 is going to go in front of the plus or minus 10. And now you split it apart and get your 2 answers. And we don't have to use our calculator because we don't have to take the square root of anything. We've already done that. The square root of 100 was 10. And it didn't have any decimals involved. So now we're going to split our answer and get 9 plus 10, which is 19. That's one of your answers. And then we're going to do it again with 9 minus 10, because you've got to do the plus 10 and then the minus 10. And so that's going to be 9 minus 10, which is negative 1. And that's your other answer. I like those where you don't have to get decimals. All right, is anybody still with me? I know I'm having Wi-Fi trouble and it looks like it's kicking people off. But the video still looks clear, so if you get kicked off, this video will be on YouTube. All right, moving on to example 8. And I'm sorry, there's a lot of examples on these, but it's because I want you to, get a lot of practice with these. This is a pretty difficult lesson. All right, look at example 8. On example 8, v squared minus 8v plus 3 equals 0. Now, this equation doesn't start out in the right form for completing the square. This 3 right here, this c term, remember, it's supposed to be over here on the other side, not 0. So the first thing we've got to do is subtract the 3 to get it off of this left side and to move it over here on the right side. So I'm going to rewrite this as v to the second minus 8v. I'm going to leave a space to complete my square and put equals. And then 0 minus 3 is going to be negative 3. So remember, all we did is subtract this 3 on both sides. And when you do, you get 0 minus 3, which is a negative 3. So now it's in the right form because our c term is over on the right side. We're ready to just add a number at the end of this left side to complete that perfect square trinomial. So what is half of 8? Half of 8 is 4. I'm going to put that over here. And when you square 4, you get 16. Okay, so half the middle term is 4. 4 squared is 16. It's always plus, so we're going to put a plus 16 at the end. And then on the right side of your equal sign, you've got to also put plus 16 at the end. So now we've got v squared minus 8v plus 16, and we've got to factor that. After you've added your number to both sides, you're ready to factor that trinomial into a binomial square. Remember, you take half of this exponent and get v in front, and then it's minus because the 8's minus. And then you take the square root of 16, which is 4. And then equals. The right side you need to simplify. Negative 3 plus 16 is going to be 13. And let's see, then we have to continue to solve for v. So we're going to take the square root of the left side and then take the square root of the right side. We're left then with v minus 4 because that's what's under the parentheses. Equals, remember it's always plus or minus your square root of 13. Now we can't take the square root of 13 like we did with the 100, so we just leave it as the square root of 13. And now we've got to continue to solve for v. We want to get v by itself, so we've got to add 4 to both sides. When we add 4 to this side, it cancels out and you get v. Remember that positive 4 goes to the right side in front of the plus or minus. And now you're ready to get your two answers. We're going to do 4 plus the square root of 13. And let me get my calculator. 4 plus the square root of 13. And then use your SD key. And then we want to round it to the nearest hundredth. Now the hundredth is the second place, so you look to the third place, and if that's 5 or higher, that second position number goes up. So it's going to be 7.61. And always double check that before you enter it so you won't miss it because of the rounding. And then we need to do this problem one more time using the minus sign. 4 minus the square root of 13. Alright, so 4 minus the square root of 13 equals. And then you have to use your SD key. 0.39, the third number's a 4, so you keep that 9, 0.39. And those are your two answers. Is anyone still there? All right, example 9. H to the second plus 12h minus 13 equals 0. Just like example 8, we have to get this minus 13 over on the right side because you don't want to have that C term there in the beginning. We've got to leave it a blank spot there to complete our square. So add 13 over here to your 0, and you get h squared plus 12h, and I'm going to leave a blank right there, equals 0 plus 13, which is 13. I now want to complete my square over here on the left side. So you take half of 12, and half of 12 is 6. I'm just going to write that down right here. And then you square 6. 6 times 6 is 36, and that's what goes at the end. And then your 36, you have to add to the right side as well. So now we want to take this trinomial, this perfect square trinomial, and factor it. When you factor it, you're going to get h plus 6. Remember, when you're factoring your trinomial, don't really worry with that 12. You're just looking at the first and last terms to get your numbers that go in the square root. I mean, not square root, in the parentheses. On the right side, 13 plus 36 is 49. Oh, good. This is another one that we're not going to have to use a calculator with. Now you want to take the square root of each side. So once you've simplified the right side and you've got the parentheses to the second power on the left side, next step is to take the square root. And when you take the square root of this left side, you're left with h plus 6. Remember, when you take the square root of a number and you're solving the equation, you're going to use plus or minus always. And the square root of 49 is 7, so you write 7 down. Remember, if you can't take the square root of that number, then you leave it under the radical. But if you can take the square root, you go ahead and take the square root. Now we want to get h by itself, so we've got to subtract 6. And when you subtract 6, that negative 6 or minus 6 goes in front of the plus or minus on the other side. So you get h equals negative 6 plus or minus 7. So to get your answer, you're going to do negative 6 plus 7. And negative 6 plus 7 is 1. So that's one of your answers. And then you're also going to do negative 6 minus 7. You've got to do plus 7 one time and minus 7 the next time. And negative 6 minus 7 is negative 13. And that's your other answer. Alright, so your two answers are 1 and negative 13. And I believe, are we on our last example? No, we have one more after this. Ooh, this is a long lesson. Okay, so n squared plus 16n equals negative 43. This one is starting out in the right form. It's got the negative 43 over here on the right side. We only have two terms on the left side, which is the way we want it. So once you know that you're in the right form, you're ready to complete your square over here. To complete your square, you take half of your 16. Half of 16 is 8. And then you square 8. So that's going to give you n to the second plus 16n plus 64. Half of 16 is 8. 8 squared is 64, so that's what you add at the end. That means you've got to come over here to the right side with your negative 43 and also add 64. So I'm going to go ahead and factor this left perfect square trinomial into my parentheses to the second power. That's going to be n plus 8. On the right side, negative 43 plus 64 is going to be 21. Positive 21. And now you are ready to take the square root of each side to solve, to solve for n. So n plus 8 to the second power, and you take the square root of it, you just get what's left in the parentheses, which is n plus 8. On the right side, remember, you can't take the square root of 21, so you just write it down again with a plus or minus. And now you've got to get n by itself, so you subtract your 8. And when you subtract your 8, that negative 8 goes in front of the plus or minus. So n equals negative 8 plus or minus the square root of 21. So to get our two answers, it's going to be negative 8 plus the square root of 21. And then it's also going to be negative 8 minus the square root of 21. And then we've got to use our calculator. Just remember, these problems are so long, you do not want to miss this because you didn't round right. So make sure you round these right. Negative 8 plus the square root of 21. And then we've got to use our SD key to get it to change to decimal. Rounding it to the nearest hundredth, negative 3.42. The 1 goes up to a 2 because that third number behind the decimal is 5 or higher. So negative 3.42. And then over here we have to do it again with negative 8 minus the square root of 21. And SD key, and that's going to be negative 12.58. Negative 12.58. Whew, my mouth is dry. Pushing through, pushing through. We have one more example, and we have to do this last example because it's just a little different. All right, look at example 11. Example 11 says 2h to the second minus 24h equals negative 50. What do you notice that's different about this equation? This one has something different than all the others that we've done today. The thing that's different is there is now this number in front of our h squared. You have a coefficient of h squared. So whenever that quadratic term has a coefficient in front, no matter what that number is, you've got to divide by that number. That's going to be your first step. And when we divide, it's not like factoring. You don't have to show that you're dividing. You just kind of in your head have to divide everything by that number. So what I'm going to do is just draw one big fraction bar and put a 2 under it. And just divide every single term by 2. 2h squared divided by 2 is going to be h squared. The 2's cancel. Minus 24h divided by 2 is going to be 12h. And then equals Negative 50 divided by 2 is negative 25. And then once you've done that step, it's just like all the others. So by now, hopefully, you're getting a little bit better at this. Okay, so remember we want to complete the square on this left side. So you half the 12 and square it. Half of 12 is 6. And then you square the 6, which is 36. So that's what I'm going to put at the end. It's going to be h to the second minus 12h plus 36 equals. We've got to add the 36 to negative 25. Negative 25 plus 36. On the left side, we're ready to put the factored result in our parentheses, which is going to be h minus 6, because you take the square root of 36, take the square root of h to the second, add negative 25 plus 36, which is positive 11. Take the square root of each side, and you get h minus 6 equals plus or minus the square root of 11. And now, because this is a minus 6 on the left side, it goes across the equal sign as a plus 6. And that plus 6, which is positive 6, is going to go in front of the plus or minus. So we're going to do 6 plus the square root of 11 and 6 minus the square root of 11 to get our two answers. And 6 plus the square root of 11. Use your SD key. And that's going to be 9.32. 9.32. And then you've got to do it again with 6 minus the square root of 11. 6 minus the square root of 11. Use your SD key, and that is 2.68. And it stays in 8 because that third number is a 3. So 2.68. And that's your two answers. Now, on your IXL, I think you only have one of those. Where you may have more than one, but I believe you don't start getting those until you get to around a 50 SMART score, 55. And so on this lesson, BB10, and you only have to get a SMART score of 60 on BB10. So to go back over, this time you've got two IXL lessons to do. The first one is really, really easy. The BB9, where you were just completing your square. You need to get a SMART score of 80. The second one is what we've just got through doing, where you solve your equation by completing the square. That's BB10, and you only have to get a SMART score of 60 on that one to get your full credit. All right, and that is it for Advanced Algebra 1. And now I'm going to go get something to drink and get ready for Algebra 2. Y'all have a good weekend. Try to get all this done. I will get it done as soon as possible so it'll be fresh on your mind. Take care. See ya.